Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Ann Wells. I live in Swedenberg. I'm a professional genealogist, and so this is really not what I normally do, a history of an area. I do the history of the people within an area, perhaps. So there aren't a lot of people mentioned. Several people ask me, but I'm sharing with you what I know about Swedenberg. I might have to move Diana. You know what? I don't need to be here. I don't need to be here. The 1860 census shows there's just a handful of Swedes that lived in McHenry County, 7 in Algonquin Township and none in Nunde, which is where the core of Swedenberg lies. The 1870 census shows a total of 65 people in McHenry County, with 25 in Nunde and 15 in Algonquin. And Crystal Lake Avenue divides the two townships. So even though, and at that point in time, there's no way to determine what street they lived on without some really... Okay. Is that better? I'll try to also speak up. Crystal Lake Avenue was the dividing line, and a number of people lived on Crystal Lake Avenue or just off of it, like half a block, and they considered themselves part of Swedenberg. So while the core of the people lived in Nunde, there were some that lived in Algonquin Township, but they were, a spit away from the rest of the people. By the 1880 census, there were 145 people in McHenry County claiming Sweden as their place of birth. We'll do this differently. 14 lived in Nunde Township, 15 in Algonquin, 40 lived in Crystal Lake, and McHenry County had added 80 people born in Sweden by 1880, an increase of 123%. The Chicago fire was probably the biggest reason that people came out here. They came to Chicago. They were city dwellers in Sweden. They came to Chicago, and they lived there until they were basically kicked out because the city said after the fire, "You will build in brick," and they were going, "We don't do brick. We do wood. We do stick houses." So, and it was extremely expensive, and they didn't have the money. So a number of them moved west. And by that I mean Crystal Lake. Some went to Rock Island. Rockford has a huge Swedish community. While a number of the Swedes were farmers, and they did farm in Chicago, a good number were city dwellers. And when you move, you do what you do. You do what you know. They didn't come to this country and decide to build in brick or to become manufacturers when all they knew was farming. So, and that's typical with any ethnic group, any group. They came here and they did what they knew. Most of the immigrants in this area were from the southern part of Sweden, which makes sense because that was the most populated. Late in the 1860s, saw several years of starvation in the cities, and they started to immigrate, and 60,000 people left Sweden in this time period. By World War I, over 1 million people had left Sweden for America. Granted, they weren't all in the Chicagoland area, but that's a lot of people. And they also left for religious freedom. Most came with somebody else, or they came to meet somebody who was already here. People did not travel alone. Again, across the board, any ethnic group, any group of people that came from another country, there was something here. Either they came, and lots of times it would be a whole neighborhood or a small village, or somebody had already come and had written back, and the old story that the sidewalks were paved with gold, you must come. Many indicated Chicago as their destination. When you look at the immigration records, you will see that. and some actually put Crystal Lake. And those are the people who definitely were coming to meet somebody that was already here. Where is Swedenberg, or where was Swedenberg? I have to change that. Where is Swedenberg? Because we still exist. The original area was bounded by Crystal Lake Avenue on the south, Route 14 on the west, Woodstock Street on the north, and Dole Avenue on the east. Eventually included Crystal Lake Avenue as more people bought homes out of that immediate area. But it stopped basically before it reached McHenry Avenue. And that's not to say that there weren't any people that lived there who didn't consider them parts of Swedenberg. Lincoln Parkway was originally known as Nelson Avenue, and the northern part of Nelson was known as Sweden Street. In 1916, the city council changed Sweden to North Nelson, and my mother-in-law always told us that the street was named after Bondi Nelson, who lived in the house, which is no longer there, next to what is now the Salvation Army Church. And thanks to Diana, she determined, and I should have done this and didn't, she determined that Bondi Nelson wasn't living there when the street was named Nelson. And she's convinced that it was Naslin Americanized to Nelson. And the Naslins are... How many Naslin relatives are in here today? Please raise your hand. Come on. There's more over there that could be raising their hand. The Naslins, Peter Naslin lived on what's now Lincoln Parkway and owned a number of pieces of property, sold it, bought it back, sold it again. And Diana's convinced that this is named after the Naslins and it was Americanized to Nelson. We'll never know, but it's a good story, and it makes sense. Sometime between 1930 and 1937, Nelson Avenue became Lincoln Parkway. And by the only way I prove that is in 1930 it was Nelson Avenue in the census, and in 1937 phone book it was Lincoln Parkway. Many people lived outside the parameters, as I noted earlier, but were active in the community and considered themselves part of the community. A number of people active in the church lived in Ridgefield and in Bearville because they were farmers and that's where the land was. Even though they lived a little bit away, they didn't think of themselves as anything other than part of Swedenberg. There were farms in this area, and Oak Street, Woodstock Street, and Dole did not exist at the time, and the property was farmed. The Peterson family donated land from Woodstock, what is now Woodstock Street, down to Crystal Lake Avenue, where the Methodist Church and the Salvation Army Church are. Many of the houses still exist on Lincoln Parkway, Francis Avenue, and Fairview Parkway. And I know there's probably others. Certainly some of the ones that are on Crystal Lake Avenue. And I apologize for this map. I tried to get a better map today, and it wasn't working. But this is basically the outline of the core of Swedenberg. Most activities centered around the church for a number of reasons. One, the language. Two, space. The houses weren't big. They didn't have 50 or 60 people coming for an anniversary or a birthday. And if you read the Nunde Herald, you'll find a lot of surprises. But they were always surprising, so it's like, okay, after you've done this for a few years and your anniversary's coming up or your birthday, do you expect it to happen to you? I laugh every time I read these because time goes on, there's more parties, there's more surprises. And yet they did this all the time. Sunday services were held Sunday was a day of church. You went to church in the morning. You went back later in the day. My mother-in-law used to say she'd go to Sunday school, spoken in Swedish. She didn't understand a word of it. Her mother was the church organist. She and her sisters were sent home to do dinner, get dinner on the table. They would come home from whatever, was it another service, I don't know. Come home, they would have dinner, and then they would all troop back in the afternoon or early evening for another church service, or maybe a surprise anniversary party or whatever. And she never learned to speak Swedish, which is sad, really. But she had the odd word, and but she said she never got anything out of going to Sunday school because for all the years that she went, it was never English. You'd think you'd get a little by osmosis or something, wouldn't you? Life in Swedenberg, they were hard workers. And interesting enough, this church was very strict, but yet they did party, and they, again, everything centered around the church. They had the Vasa Order of America, which nicknamed the Vikings. But they helped with the language. They helped them settle in. They helped them become a little bit more Americanized. And it was a social group, so they probably had their share of activities as well. It was open to men who were over the age of 18. But in that time, the men were the ones that were out working, so they're the ones who needed to speak English and become as American as they could. I'm guessing they hoped that the men would come home and share the English language with the wives, but that didn't always happen. So you had the men who could speak enough English to work, to get by, and the wives who really, until their kids started speaking English, really were isolated, which again keeps them in the Swedish community. And they provided benefits with like an insurance company for illness and final expenses at death. There is a, come on in. We went to Bishop Hill, and there is and I use the term loosely, headquarters for the Vikings or Vasa, but they were closed, and only in the last few years have I seen anything on their website that would induce me to go again, but I'm not sure that they had too many records, which is unfortunate. This was the first church building on the corner of Crystal Lake Avenue and Lincoln Parkway. The first services were held on the Dole, what we know as the Dole Mansion, on that property. Mr. Dole allowed the Swedes to come and worship there. There weren't hundreds. There were just a handful. Then by 1875, they started meeting in Peter Naslin's house, which today is at 61 Lincoln Parkway. Again, there weren't 50 people that came to worship on a Sunday. There was just a handful. At one time, a realtor in Crystal Lake was selling the house and said it had been a church and converted. It was never a church. It was always a single-family home. But they opened it up to the Swedish community for religious services. And in the summer of 1893, they had built a new church, which was that first one. But they didn't become organized as a standalone house of worship until 1903. So even though the church was there, they never had their own minister until later. And this is an added-on version. Seminarians from the Evangelical Free Church in Chicago, Moody Bible Institute in North Park College sent out seminarians to preach on a Sunday. And you can go through the old papers and see they usually knew. Paper came out once a week on Thursday, and usually they knew who was going to be preaching on the Sunday. But sometimes it would be the same person 2 times in a row, but it was not consistent. It was basically a surprise. Who's going to be here next time? And every time I look at this, I think of Emmanuel Lutheran. But this house that's back here no longer exists. So that's why I know that it's not, but it does look like Emmanuel Lutheran. I love this picture. This picture Debbie Naslin Schultz. I love this picture. I love the runner down the center of the church. IKEA. If you've ever been to IKEA and you've seen those throw rugs that they have, they look just like that. The thing that terrifies me about this picture, there's lit candles on that tree. Just wonder how the church survived. You know, I mean, or their homes. I mean, let's face it, it wasn't just the church that had the tree. I believe is this Albert, or does anybody know Albert Naslin? Who? Oh, okay. Well, where's the Naslin in here? Him? Oh, okay. And this is in the church as well. Life in Swedenberg, the people, maybe it was self-imposed isolation. Again, it was a language issue. My mother-in-law, who was born in 1909, said they were not encouraged to mingle with the Americans, the English-speaking members of Crystal Lake. They were sent to school. They came home and they basically stayed in Swedenberg. So it was the kids, certainly by her generation, were speaking English because they were going to the schools. But they weren't encouraged to do a lot with these other friends. And my mother-in-law often spoke of going down to the lake without permission, or God forbid, going to the movies. And they would have to sneak around to do that. But they weren't encouraged. George Naslin and Harry Rydquist were the first to marry outside the community, and people were appalled. You're going to marry who? And she's from where? And I don't know about Harry, what religion he was raised in. One would think the Swedish church, but he ended up, or his family ended up being Catholic, which must have, how do you deal with this? George Naslin, I'm guessing he stayed with the Swedish church. Again, Swedish was spoken at church, and the records were in Swedish until about the 1920s. I started a project a number of years ago of, and I can't remember the name of the person that started, wrote a manuscript about Swedenberg, and there were a lot of names. And so I took that, and I started setting up files for each married couple and trying to find out what I could about them. And eventually, I called the Swedish Evangelical Church, or the Free Evangelical Church in Crystal Lake, and asked if I could look at their records. And I had already looked at the Congregational Church, and a number of the Swedes ended up at the Congregational Church. And the records there were wonderful. Every little bit of information was on a 3x5 card. I just had to pull out the surname I was looking for, and I could sit there for an hour or so and extract all this information. So I go to the Evangelical Church, and I asked if I could do the same there. And they were very nice, and the girl goes, I just don't know where the records are. She goes, they might be in the boiler room. And I was like, oh my God. So I said, well, she said, let me call you back. So a few days went by, and she called back, and she said, we would love to have you come, look at the records, anytime. She said, just come in. So I said, well, I'd like to set up an appointment. I didn't want to show up cold, So I went in, and I opened up the book, and there were two books. One was baptisms, marriages, and funerals, and the other was I guess from the governing board of the church, their minutes for their meetings. And she said, which do you want? And I said, well, I'll take the birth, marriages, and those first, and plug that in, and I'll look at the others. So this was over a summer several times, and everything was in Swedish. But the Swedish books of vital records, they came from Sweden, and they had the headings, and if you have a good dictionary, you can figure out what they mean, so it was very easy to extract. Then I went to the minutes, opened up the book, and it's all in Swedish. So I went out, and I thought, oh, I'm smart, I'll go out and buy a Swedish American dictionary, but the problem with that is the language had changed, and there were hints in the book, but it was difficult. It took me a really long time. And I deciphered a couple of stories, and the basics about the church, that when they hired a new minister, or at the end of the year when they were totaling up the new members. And it was really interesting, but it was so frustrating because I couldn't read it. And I turned the page, and it was written in English. And I looked at the bottom of it, and my husband's grandfather was now the church secretary, and he could not read or write Swedish. He could speak it. I was like, oh, thank you, God. I mean, and luckily one of the things I was working on, they finished up writing it in English so I could make heads or tails of it. So they really stayed Swedish. I mean, even into their church records. Again, they spoke it at home. Of course, that's always nice when you can speak a language and your children can't. But my mother-in-law and her two sisters never learned much in the way of Swedish. What did the people do? They weren't much different than anybody else in the community. Many of them were in the building trades. There's a number of houses in Crystal Lake that were built by the Naslins, the Bergs. I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think, but many houses were built by the Swedes, or the insides were finished by the Swedes. They did carpenter work. Many were farmers. Again, those were the people. Even though there were farms in the town of Crystal Lake, for the most part, they were on the outside. Many worked at the pickle factory, and that would be the pickle factory that was here, not the newer one. The Oliver typewriter factory in the early 1900s. They provided transportation. In Terracotta, they also provided transportation. So many people, even though they might have been builders or in the trades, would also work at these other businesses, especially in the wintertime. I mean, now building is almost year-round here, but it wasn't then. So, and a lot of them also worked at the ice factory in the winter because they couldn't build. And a great number of them were self-employed. This is really... Can you hear me? Or is that after that? All right. This is the Oliver typewriter factory. This is Terracotta. Woodstock. Oliver typewriter factory was in Woodstock. And this is Terracotta. Like many aliens, I use that in a nice way, they had to be here 5 years to become a citizen. They could apply, they could declare their intent to become a citizen before that 5 years, and many of them did. A number of them became citizens at the 5-year mark. Some took longer, and some never did. And I know you can't read this. This is petition to become a citizen. If your ancestor became a citizen after 1906, you're really lucky because that's when all the information is on the documents. Before that, it was basically you came from this country, you arrived on this date, and you give up all not what's the word I want allegiance to whoever it was. And now you're becoming an American citizen. And that was it. Yes? You're the one that hit me up with that last time. And here's a blown up. But this is wonderful because it'll tell you the name of the wife, the the children, when and where they were born. I mean, there's just so much information. In this time frame, if you came over here and you married, if you were a man and you married an American or a woman who was a citizen, she lost her citizenship. And when you became a citizen, then she would have to get her own back. So, think about that. You're madly in love with somebody, and you're not going to be an American citizen for 5 years, or however long he has to wait. This is the Karlstead home. He was a musical instrument maker. He'd been in Chicago, and he came out here, and they did not live here long. He thought it would be nice to be away from the city, but then the market wasn't here, and he was still selling in Chicago. So he and his family packed up and left. Many of you probably know this house. This is the house that's by North Elementary School. Between the two driveways, they've added another driveway now. I wish they'd take the porch off. This is the house across the street from us. This was built by, and his first name escapes me, Berg. This is probably the oldest house on our street. It was built about 1870, 71. His daughter, her name was Irene, and my mother-in-law always told us that she was named after her, and she went on, not sure exactly what she was a nurse, and she trained at, name escapes me, but ended up at Swedish Covenant Hospital. And I believe, my mother-in-law used to say she started the hospital, but I think she started the nursing program there. So this house is about, 140 years old. Today it's a coral color with darker coral trim. This is the house next door. This is Peter Naslin's home. This is where church services were held. Again, it was never, ever a church. It was always a single-family home. Today it's green. This is 1924 photo of this house. And this house is now a 2-flat, and the porches have been taken off. The bay window is taken off. And I keep going back to it. I told my husband today, I said, it really doesn't look like that house. But if you look at the top, you have those 3 windows. They're still there. There's a house a couple doors up that I keep thinking is this house, but it's not. It's so obvious it's the same house. And I'm glad I got that in my brain now because it's bugged me for eons. This house was built in 1903 by Martin Naslin, the fellow who couldn't read and write Swedish. And his wife-to-be was in Chicago, and her mother did everything she could think of to keep them from getting married. It's not so much that she didn't like him, is that she didn't want to lose her daughter and her income. And so she put all these conditions on their marriage, and I have letters between them, and one of them says, he writes to her and says, okay, this is done, this is done, this is done, now what? And so they finally got married. And Mom and Sophie, the bride-to-be, her mother and sister came out and lived on the other side of them. So if she's not going to stay in Chicago, by God, we're going to go and be with her. But this house, when it was, my mother-in-law remembers the outhouse, and she says she remembers them building the carriage barn. I'm not too sure about that, but it's still standing. And this is what it looks like, more or less, today. With Lincoln Parkway. There's the carriage barn. This is the house that no longer exists. It's north of the Salvation Army Church, and they owned the property, and they tore the house down. I think it had really not been kept up, and mold was an issue. It's a shame, but it's been gone for years now. And this was, I don't know, did I say this was owned by Bondi Nelson? When the residents of Swedenberg died, they had very tight ties to Chicago. A number of families had family members who lived in Chicago. Many of them lived in what we know as Andersonville today. Clark, between Foster and Irving Park, maybe not quite that far south. Anyway, so when they died, if other family members had died before them and they were buried in Rose Hill or Graceland, that's where a lot of them were sent to be buried. And certainly there's a ton of them in Union Cemetery in Crystal Lake. This is Rose Hill. This is Graceland. And this is Union. If you walk through here sometime, look at the Swedish name. I mean, there's lots of them. The Peterson family has a huge area. All the stones are exactly the same. You can look at that. Many of the Swedes served in local government. Not the original generations that came, but afterwards. Many of them served in World War I and World War II. The local American Legion chapter is... thank you. William Chandler Peterson. I totally lost his first name. It was named after him. He died in France in about 1917. So they did contribute to the bigger community and served. They weren't any different. Their biggest thing certainly was their culture and language, but they weren't any different from other people that lived in this area or lived anywhere really. The Swedes held down. The Swedes worshipped at what was the Swedish Mission Church, which is now Salvation Army. But they helped to form Bethany Lutheran. And my mother-in-law always, I don't think she was real happy about the change. I mean, she'd grown up at Swedish Mission and then she moved. Dorothy Heisler, who told me that they changed because the Swedish Mission insisted on having services in Swedish. And the church had gotten another generation and they wanted it in English. I've always thought that they broke away from the strictness of the church. And today, Dick Kleffer has said, "Oh, they did it because they were so strict." So now I'm happy. I'm confident in saying that. Really? That's interesting. Did you hear that? That the men of the Swedish Mission Church could not join Vasa as members of the Swedish Church because they would have to declare a loyalty to them. So that's something I need to work on. Thank you. Bethany was formed in 1923, and the first building was available in 1924. And the first thing they did was offered services in Swedish. So obviously the language wasn't the issue when they left the Swedish Mission Church. Excuse me. When I first started coming to visit in Crystal Lake, we were married in California and lived there continued to live there for a number of years. But I can remember turning off of 176 onto Lincoln Parkway, and there was a little sign with an arrow that said Swedish Mission Church. So now I wish I'd taken a picture of it, but of course didn't think about it. The Swedes left their mark. They built a number of homes in Crystal Lake, and I use that in the broadest sense, not just Nunde. They were certainly active in their community. They were small businessmen and women. They owned stores in town. They were certainly active in their church. And they thought this, excuse me, they thought this was a good place to live. And many descendants still live in Crystal Lake, and some still live in Swedenberg. I think we need to go to the city council and ask for a sign. You are now entering Swedenberg. And I slaughtered this the last time, so I will not even attempt it, but it says thank you in Swedish. Are there any questions? Well, that's what I said before. If you're a descendant from a Rosell or a Naslund or any other Swedish person that lived in Swedenberg, will you stand up? Oh, I know, there's lots of them. That's it? Come on, there's more. All right, so see, thank you. We still live here. We need to have a sign that says entering Swedenberg, or this is historic Swedenberg, something. Because these people, while they isolated themselves because of the language, especially the women, Crystal Lake wouldn't be what it is today. It would be something else if we had not had this Swedish influence. So I think we deserve that. Are there other questions or comments? Yes. Uh-huh. The question was about the holidays. There were some women sitting in front. This one? I have to say that when I was transcribing those Swedish records, that to my knowledge there were no women on the board. And that could have just been that time frame. It's not something I've looked into. Certainly they were not ministers or pastors. But they were, as in most churches, I think the women were what held them all together. Certainly the women were the one that said, come on, it's Sunday, we're going to church. And that really hasn't changed. But as far as the running of the church, I didn't see it, but maybe it's something to look into, because that's a good question. Thank you. Yes. Yes, there was a train, a spur that there were other in Crystal Lake, Nunde. There were 2 train tracks, one on each side of the depot, and one was what is now Chicago Northwestern. I don't remember what the other one was, but they may have done a spur up there. Certainly they needed the railroad to get the product out, so they probably used to get them in, but they did provide transportation, as did Woodstock Typewriter. Sandy. Yeah, and they lived in the house that's on the corner of Lincoln Parkway and Crystal Lake Avenue. It's a little small house. Right, and it's across it. Alice Benson. What was her? Ruth, yeah. I'm sorry. Sandy was saying that Ruth and Alice Benson were the first twins born in Swedenberg, and they lived in the house that was right across the street from the church, but on Lincoln Parkway. Jeff. Just grandma and yeah. And that's sad, really, when you think about it, that one of the greatest gifts you can give your children is to have them be bilingual. And I have a daughter who married a Hispanic young man, and they are taking Spanish in school because it's not being spoken at home. I mean, the odd word, but again, and that was the Swedish. Yes. Right, and people came to this country with an attitude, we've left the old country behind. We are now Americans. And that's a good thing. But to leave that language behind is, yes. Yeah. Right. And it's not just the Swedes. Anybody that came over. When I was born in England, my mother's English, my father's American. And when I was little, my mother said I spoke English and I spoke American, depending which parent I was talking to. And when I went to kindergarten, I had a very English accent. Well, I had just come back from 9 months in England, so and I had a girlfriend all through school who said, you lost that lovely accent, but you don't want to be different as a child. And so you lose it, and again, you've lost the language because you don't use it at all. So it is a shame, but it just fascinated me that so many of the Swedes would speak Swedish at home in front of their children, which is always a great thing. You know, we go through that period where we're spelling, so they don't understand, then they learn to spell. Well, if you're speaking another language and they don't, you can go literally forever. My daughter and her husband do that. They speak Spanish, but now they've got 2 kids who are pretty good, so that's coming to an end. But yeah, they came over here, they wanted to be Americans, they left, especially if they left the old country under not so good reasons, you know, if the government hadn't provided for them. I mean, people were starving to death in the 1860s, and so they came here, and what would make you want to stay a Swede when you've been treated so badly, or what would make you want to stay anything if you'd been treated so badly? So, are there any other questions? Yes. Some of them did. Religious, yeah. Some of them came because they wanted to get away from the strictness, probably. That's that when they came here and started the Swedish Mission Church, it was what they knew. And so they had this church. Well, then as they became Americanized, then they're like, wait a minute, not everybody thinks like this. So, but there were some people that came early that said, I can't live like this anymore. I want to go to a movie or whatever it was. Yeah, and in Sweden, you couldn't move. You couldn't decide that you and your family were going to move next month without going to the church and going to the police department. So you had the police that would take that information, and then you had to go to the church to be sure that you'd been baptized or whatever, because you couldn't go to another church if you hadn't been. So maybe they just got tired of it. I'm not saying a million people came here because of religious, but that's one of the reasons they came here. Pardon me? Sure. Right. Well, you think of, I mean, I'm hearing Bethany was created because of the language issue, and so these people in mass left. But that really wasn't the issue. It was the strictness of the church, and it just, maybe it took several generations. But I don't know what the percentage is that came here because of religious reasons, but certainly some of them did. Yeah. Sure. Go ahead. Sundays. Did you all hear Debbie? Did you all hear that about the candy? Okay. Are there any other questions? Comments? Jeff? I have maps coming out of the yin yang, and some of them I have marked with the houses. I've gone around, and especially the houses that are on Francis in Fairview Parkway. I've got pictures of most of those houses, but they're not in any particular order. Or another project, I suppose. Any other questions? Okay. Yes. I think it was Elgin something or other, but I'm not remembering. Oh, we'll have to look on our way out. I'll take a look. Thank you. I will make a comment about the railroad line that went down Dole. It was built so Mr. Dole could provide transportation for his guests who were coming to his daughter's wedding. And there was some sort of a canopy or something so that people wouldn't get wet if it was raining. But then it was used to get ice out of here, so it served two purposes. But it was built to provide transportation to guests at a wedding. There was some. Oh, I know. A couple of things to announce. Are there no more questions? Okay. A couple of things to announce. The next two lectures will be December the 8th, the history of the Crystal Lake Fire Rescue Department, and that will be with Chris Williams. And on January the 12th will be the history of the Crystal Lake Public Library, which is celebrating their 100th anniversary as well, with Sue Riegler. And I have one more announcement if you want a little bit more Swedish. On Sunday, December the 8th at Bethany, a Santa Lucia and Christmas concert, which will be at 3 o'clock. So activities coming up. Well, thank you very much. Hope you've enjoyed. Oh, yes, Debbie. Oh,